everybody. Today's the first day of our small group study based on the, the movie from which that little clip came, called Overcoming. And the question that in your small groups tonight you'll talk about is, who am I? Now, this is the first time that we've done what we're doing here. There are 5 lessons in this small group study, and so we're going to try to tailor a series of 5 sermons around the study, and you'll discuss the clip, the little study booklets you have, and then the masterpiece dynamic sermon that will cover that particular subject. Okay? Before we do that, let me just tell you as a side note how much no one can describe, I can't describe you, and I'm sure none of you can understand how much I love technology. This is what's been going on. I don't know what's been going on, but with our audio visual, that's why we have a black screen and little letters down in the bottom, and I just love it. We are having issues that I don't know when they'll get solved or if they're solvable, but anyway, that's a little explanation as to why things look a little different. You pay any attention to the Iowa caucuses when they used everything electronic? And then a week or so later, the New Hampshire, they've used paper for 100 years. Theirs was fine. Okay? Except, now my heated steering wheel in my truck, we got to have that. And the little thing that thumps the side of your driver's seat when you go over the line, I want all that. But the rest of the technology, I don't care. The question, who am I, is a good question. When I first looked at it, I thought, well, what in the world will we do with this? But actually, it's a core question. Who am I? Usually, the answer is based on what I do. That isn't bad. A lot of the names we have today, last names, come from way back in, 10 generations ago, named after, my great was a blacksmith, was a tinner, was whatever. So the Bible's full of that. So-and-so was a mighty warrior. So-and-so was a great counselor, a prophet, or whatever. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. But usually the answer, who am I, is based on what I do, or based on social standing, or based on some position I hold, or how many possessions I have. Can be other questions or other answers. But these are all external. The true answer has to be based on the inner character of self. It's an inner character issue. Now, a little background. We are patterned after God, and God's a person. One of the best definitions, short little definitions of God, He is an eternal, personal being of infinite power, knowledge, and goodness. Now, God's infinite. We aren't. But we are exactly like Him in that we are persons. He's a person. So That's part of the image of God in us. Now, what does it mean that God is a person and so are we? There's probably more than this, but let me just give you 3 basic characteristics of what it means to be a person. 1, self-awareness or self-consciousness. I'm aware that I am. Okay? 2, self-determination. The capacity to choose. We can act. We take specific actions based on specific decisions that we make. 3, uniqueness. There's no one else like us. Now, for some people, we're grateful for that. We're grateful that there's not one other person like you. But we are. We're not somebody else. We're us. Now, let me go into self-awareness a little more. Self-awareness involves, and I am hopefully getting somewhere, self-awareness involves the capacity of self-transcendence. Now, let me try to think of a better word than that. It's the ability to stand outside of ourselves and look at ourselves. Now, if you think about that, it's a little hard to describe and it's a little hard to understand. But I can, and I just use the term I, but I can look at myself and pass a judgment on myself. I'm standing outside of myself, looking at myself and evaluating myself. Okay? Everybody, should we go eat donuts? A second aspect of self-awareness is the capacity of self-examination and self-evaluation. I can look at myself and I can say, I am this, I am that. Conscience is involved here too. God is not out of this picture. God is not silent while you and I would say continually, moment by moment every day, we are aware of ourselves and we are passing evaluation on ourselves. We're thinking about ourselves. Okay? But God is not silent. Our conscience is His voice that also gives His opinion. Okay? He has an evaluation of us too. Now, these capacities to judge ourselves, stand outside of ourselves and see ourselves and evaluate ourselves, part of evaluating ourselves also involves the capacity of comparison, meaning what I am, what I ought to be. And in many cases, there's a gap. Okay? So, in minor things, and maybe major, we have the whole concept of resolutions. New Year's resolutions. If you notice, it's always certain times of the year that certain ads come on TV. And it's right after the 40 days or whatever of just harrowing eating between Thanksgiving to New Year's that you're just hit with all of these Nutrisystem and whoever, all these ads, because the vast majority of people have done self-comparison and self-evaluation, okay? And they're helped to it by their bathroom scale. And so, You make an evaluation of yourself. I ought to be this, I am this, so there's a gap. And we attempt then to close that gap. Okay? Now, but there's a huge problem. Those capacities that we have that were built into us when God made us in His image and in His likeness, they remain. We still have them, but they're out of whack. Sin, like a compass that's off. Sin has damaged these capacities so that they're not only often inaccurate, but intentionally so. You understand me? I can evaluate myself. In the background is this voice of God called conscience. And what He's saying, I don't want to hear. So I go to certain measures to rationalize, to explain it away, to silence it. I'm okay. I'm fine. And in the course of that, who am I grows further and further apart from reality. Does that make sense? The problem with, I think one of the best definitions of sin, and there's a lot of good ones, but one of the best definitions of sin is really excessive love of self. I'm supposed to love myself. Jesus said the only way I can measure how I ought to love you is I'm to love you like I love myself. Okay? So there's nothing wrong. Well, let's back up. There's something drastically wrong if I don't have a normal love of self. Sin is an abnormal love of self. Therefore, since self looms in our lives, and that becomes, pleasing myself becomes our highest value, when God's voice or other people's voices or whoever contradicts that self-image I have, I don't like it. I don't agree with it. It can't be right. I'm not that person, but I am. And we will invent complete self-images in our own thinking of ourselves that are not connected to reality. They're false. Here's the one thing, though. It is virtually impossible to quiet that other that the Bible calls still, small voice. It's virtually impossible to silence that, no matter how much I might try to push that opinion of me away and adopt my opinion of me. It's almost impossible to shut that voice up. Now, what does that produce? Tension, stress, disharmony. The gears don't mesh in my life. And so, I am a mess. Therefore, I kick the dog, scream at my wife, slam the doors, whatever. Does any of that make sense? We're an inward mess. We try to make ourselves think we're something when God's trying to tell us, no, you're not. You're this. So the answer to who I am is not in us. It's not within us. It has to come from outside. And the only one who has an accurate opinion is God. Because he is, quote, the heart-knowing God. Nothing is hidden from him. He knows everything. He said, I know your thoughts before you think them. I know every word that comes out of your mouth before you say them. I can't escape the gaze of that God. And here's the thing about God that, we sometimes wish we could get away from. He won't quit taking opinions of us. He has an opinion of us. He watches us. He sees us. He knows us. He hears us. Plumbs the depths of our hearts that where we can't even see. And here's the great physician of souls and the heart-knowing God. And in his kindness and goodness, not because he wants to trample us, but in his kindness he said, friend, you are this. And I don't like it. I don't want to hear that. It takes great moral courage to go to God and look at him closely enough to then see me. That make sense? Isaiah. In Isaiah 6. Quickly, Isaiah was a great and very reputable person. He was what you would call a courtesan. He was a member of the king's court. He came and went in and out of the king's presence. He didn't need an appointment. He didn't have to get a letter of commendation from somebody else. He had access to the side door into the king's throne room. He could come and go as he wanted. He was that close to power. Even his literary ability in the writing of the book of Isaiah, he's learned, articulate, in spite of, or along with, the help of the Holy Spirit in writing that book. God speaks through personalities with education that they have and so forth. Isaiah was by all accounts a top intellect, administrator, man of God. And in the 6th chapter of Isaiah, it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. His train of his robe, his train filled the temple. And the seraphim, the angels, sang, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God. And he said, the walls shook. The pillars of the doors shook at the sound of the voice. And then, what does he say? Then I cried out, I am. Here's the question, who am I? Isaiah said, I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. How did he find that out? Because he said, because my eyes have seen the Lord. To draw close to God is to see myself. The closer I gaze at God, the clearer I see myself. It's frightening then to most of us to draw near to God. How many of us put off, even minor maybe, little doctor's appointments because I don't want to see what the numbers are. I don't want to know about it. It's the same thing morally. There's a natural fear of approaching God for what he might see. And here's another problem with God. What he sees, he just simply won't be quiet about. You know? He doesn't say, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings. How many times do we not tell somebody something because, well, we don't want to, I don't want to hurt their feelings. God doesn't have that problem. He says, hey, let me tell you something. I'm in the middle of something. I don't care. I got something to say. He tells me his opinion. So, here's where redemption has to come in. If I'm ever going to really not only see who I am now, but become who God wants me to be, redemption is the only hope we have. God has to correct and revitalize, redeem, transform me. And when he does that, these capacities that we have to self-evaluate, self-examine, clear up. He resets them. I mentioned earlier, I hate technology in a lot of ways. And I got an email the other day, I think it was Friday. I get an email, okay? It's from OnStar. And, you know, it's got this yellow star, kind of red thing. Needs immediate attention. What? Well, your tires are low. They're below manufacturing or whatever. They're supposed to be 35 pounds, and they're 32 and 31. And they give you all four of them. They show little pictures of tires, and you know, the whole thing is the sky is falling. This is Chicken Little calling, and if you don't fix these tires, you're going to go off the road in a fiery crash because you know they go on all this. Here's the thing that bugs me about it. So I go out yesterday and I get my compressor going, and I go out there and I've got several different tire, pressure indicators to figure out, turn the car on. It says, 31, 32. I check every one of them. Dead on 35. Okay? I know what happened. I just had my oil changed and the tires rotated. And I had to take it back the last time I did that because they didn't, quote, relearn the system so it would tell me accurately. Now, in this case, then, the problem, that's the problem that we can get into ourselves. We're getting different messages. If we're not right with God, then the message that's incorrect is always going to be coming from us. Always. And hear me on this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But the message can be incorrect in several different ways. Most of the time, because of the sin of pride, our evaluation of ourselves is going to be better than it really is. Almost always. But sometimes it's the other way. I'm a creep, I'm a scum, I'm worthless. That's a lie too. If we look to God, because God doesn't say that. God said, while you were yet unlovely, that means repugnant, obnoxious, irritating, takes more religion you can put up with. God said, when you were like that, I loved you and died for you. So that's a lie too. Most of the time we think more highly of ourselves. Paul warned the Romans, don't think more highly of yourself than you should. That's probably the more needed warning. But the opposite is wrong too. Both of them come from the devil, who loves to lie to us about God and us. And if he convinces us of those lies, we're off. Okay? So, I'm getting emails that tells me something that's not true. I did go check. We have to too. There are times when we do get messages we need to check. Anybody in the Bible do that? Yeah. David, Psalm 139. He talked about how he hated the enemies of the Lord and he loved God and everything. And he says, I walk within my house with a perfect heart. That was David's sense of himself. But just to be sure, he ends that psalm, search me, O God, and know my heart. See if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in the paths of everlasting righteousness. God's the final verdict, who I am. Now, only alignment with God can allow me to accurately identify myself. I need to have clean hands and a pure heart. Only then can I accurately examine myself, which you might think, well, are we even supposed to? Let God do it. Yeah, he does. But Paul told the Corinthians, he said, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. That's a pretty tall order. You check yourselves out to make sure you're right with God. There are some categories. There are some boxes we can check. There is a tremendous little verse, couple verses in 1 John. 1 John, I believe it's chapter 4. This, I don't want to take too much time to try to explain it, but he said, if your heart condemns you, he's talking to Christians, if your heart condemns you, God is greater than your heart. He's saying there that even because we're fallen, our judgment is sometimes clouded. Emotions can affect our judgments. The devil has access to our emotions. He can stir us up. He can depress us. He can work on us so that what we believe, our heart condemns us. John said, God's greater than your heart and knoweth all things. Okay, what's he mean there? You can't even always trust your own self-evaluation, especially if it is condemning. So then he goes on and he says this. If you know that you love God, you love God's children, you love the people of God, if you take inventory and you say, you know what, being as honest as I can, I've not willfully, deliberately, intentionally disobeyed God. The record is clear here. I've not willfully disobeyed God. John then says this. With this, what's this? This is the knowledge that I love God and I love my fellow believers and I'm walking in His commandments. With this, now notice this, with this piece of evidence, we assure our own hearts before God in His presence. God's not doing the assuring. I am. With the knowledge that I'm walking with God. Anybody ever read that and paid close attention to it? That's a fascinating passage. That there are times, because of our fallen abilities and a supernatural foe who's a liar, that he will do his best to convince the person who does care about God. Listen, people who couldn't care less about God don't have their hearts condemn them. They don't care. That's the problem. It's the well-meaning, tender-hearted soul who wants to please God and to whom God's opinion matters that the devil can often get us to condemn ourselves when we don't deserve it. And so God gives us something there. He said, don't necessarily go for that. It goes along with what John said earlier in the same letter. Try the spirits. Try the impressions that come to you to see whether they be of God. They're not all from God. Now, to resist God's rightful mastery, and this is when we're aligning with God so that we can accurately know who am I. To resist God's rightful mastery of me for fear that I'll lose myself is idiocy when you think about it. I want to retain myself. I want to retain mastery of myself, so I don't want to give mastery over to God because it'll wreck life. I grew up in a wonderful home where I don't know how Christianity could have been lived out any better, honestly. It wasn't on either side of the fence where it's too loose or too rigid. I had no excuse, none, because of what I saw in my home lived out as genuine Christianity. Yet, for years, I resisted giving God my heart because I knew that He would wreck my life. He'd rob me of all fun. He'd just scrutinize me and find out what I wanted to do, and then he'd tell me I couldn't. And he'd find out what I loved and take it away. Really. I used to hear, God's got a choice of a mate for you. And I was thinking, if I get saved, there'll be some absolute, that I'll have to marry. Seriously. We're wacky when we're not right with God. Whatever career. My father, I guess you'd use this term, whatever it means. He was a very successful pastor. Most pastors, even to this day, have short tenures because people run them off. And sometimes, a lot of times, it's deserved. When my dad was pastoring, the average stay of a pastor was 3 years. He never stayed any place less than, I think, 12 or 13 years. So I saw successful pastorate. And I didn't grow up as a lot of preachers' kids. Boy, I hate the pastorate. I'll never do that. My dad didn't complain about it. My mom, it was considered a calling, a high calling, an honorable thing, so we didn't gripe about it. Yet, knowing that God would call me to preach, or knowing I was called to preach, no way in the world I was going to give my soul's mastery over to God because He'd make me preach. And I'd have to live that kind of life. But with people like you. Stupid. Went against every bit of evidence I had that God was good. Life with God was perfect. No better way to live than God's way. But I resisted it. Only when I finally aligned with God and obey him and give in to him and give him absolute, utter control of my heart and my life, take my hands off of it. Only then do we accurately then see, who am I? How do I fit in God's plan? What's his place for me? Why did he put me here? What's he want me to do in this job or that? Why has he allowed this to come into my... I don't know, but God has a plan. It'll unfold. When we can get to thinking like that, then we know, who am I? I think the best description of that little question really is Paul. Every letter Paul wrote, how did he start it out? Paul, a bond servant, and it means, the Greek word is slave. Paul, a slave of Jesus. Who am I? A slave of Jesus? Is there any better thing to be? I serve Jesus. William Carey, who ended up being a missionary to India back in the 1800s, was a shoe cobbler in, I don't know if it was England or Ireland or wherever. But he said, someone asked him what he did, and he said, well, I work for God. I repair shoes to make a living. I work at the mines. I teach. I sell. I whatever. But that's my side job. That I'm moonlighting. I'm moonlighting out at the mine or whatever. Because my full-time job, I'm a slave of Jesus. That's who I am. So that we can say, only one life. It will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Who are you? Let's just quietly bow our heads. Just take a few moments to let some things sink in our hearts and examine ourselves. We have that capacity. Who am I?